I don't see the point of doing an introduction.
No?
No.
Okay.
I think we're trying to do this a little bit more casually.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about Dr. Iain McGilchrist, who is a neuroscientist out of Scotland. He studied at Oxford. 10 years he did English before turning to medicine, turning to the study of the brain and the study of the hemispheres. But I think for us, and we'll be able to explore his doctrines and a bit of his biography and why he did what he did in the course of the episode, but I think for us the opening question is whether or not we should even be considering him a philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not a guy who basically wrote a giant book on the brain and on the hemispheres should be considered a philosopher. To what extent he's trying to answer philosophical questions? Is he using philosophical methods? Is there a kind of hidden philosophical project? Where should we start with maybe just the very beginnings of that question?
I mean, I think first of all, he has very philosophical ambitions, I would say, because he talks a lot about the nature of reality, how things really are, you could say on a surface level, you know, in the first instance, those ambitions are there. And then perhaps it's another question whether he manages to live up to those ambitions, whether his work actually tells us something about the nature of reality.
But what do you think his ambitions are? Just simply.
Well, to talk about the nature of reality. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and the brain is this sort of facility in which to talk about reality. I mean, the brain is this, it's not quite a laboratory, it's not quite a technology, it's, you know, it's an organic piece of matter, but it also seems to organize for us all of our impressions of reality, our thoughts about reality, and in ways that I think are difficult to describe and disclose. I mean, one thing to say is that I think that McGilchrist certainly attacks traditional philosophical questions very differently than a philosopher.
Yeah, totally. Very much.
Something like truth, for instance. I think that he's not interested in philosophical categories of truth, maybe very ancient ones. The occasional philosopher I think he likes to mention, he likes the phenomenologists, Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty.
Bergson, too.
Bergson. But yeah, the question of truth for him is not really a philosophical category, which is maybe the important point there.
Mm-hmm.
For him, he wants to think of it as somehow a natural and scientific category, which is maybe part of his, at least, intellectual revolution. You know, getting truth back into the sciences seems like a pretty good way of describing his project. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. You mean, yeah, getting truth back as in science is not just an instrument, science is not just about pragmatically coming up with theories, it is very much about the pursuit of, capital T, truth.
Yeah, and therefore, like, so how do you describe truth scientifically? Is that a contradiction in terms?
Yeah.
You know, but then obviously there's some failure on the part of philosophers.
Yeah.
You know, for describing truth. You know, is it a logical enterprise? Is it a linguistic enterprise? Much of the philosophy that McGilchrist must have encountered, for instance, at Oxford, would have been, I presume, except for maybe a handful of people, highly analytic. And therefore it's about truth as a logical and linguistic enterprise. Truth reduced either to its common sense structure, or the truth of logic, the truth of language, but not necessarily a very sort of, an ancient idea of truth, or going back to the origins of philosophy in the Greek period. That truth is connected to our essence, almost as if we have a relationship to the truth even before we become fully aware of that. So it's truth not as an empirical practice. Plato, of course, just describe knowledge as a form of remembrance, because for him the sort of philosophical structure of it was that, well, you're already in the truth, it's just a question of becoming aware of it. So for him, all knowledge could not be new. It had to somehow be an act of remembrance to know anything, which is also why Socrates was called the midwife. You know, he did a kind of thinking where it was just about him getting people to remind themselves of what they knew, which is why he could take, you know, at one extreme, this approach of I know only that I know nothing, so a total kind of point of emptiness, a pure frame. But then on the other hand, this sort of belief in other people, belief in a relationship to truth as interior and inherent, such that even if he knew nothing, he could still presume that nonetheless we were immersed within truth, so long as we were within the world.
I think what maybe people who perhaps haven't read a lot of philosophy might underestimate about this question about truth is that, you know, truth as a concept seems very intuitive on one level, but then on another level it's very hard to actually spell out what it is.
You mean
at least that's one way to put it.
Technically, rigorously,
yes.
proving a theory of truth, say?
Yeah. Well, but also not just a theory, because then those theories often fall short in a quite obvious way already.
Which is definitely McGilchrist's point. I mean, I think this is, again, the frustration he has with maybe many kinds of academic disciplines, and probably the scientific disciplines as well. Again, he's not really a person who's at home in science or in philosophy, as far as I can tell, because he's not interested in the standard practice of approaching an intellectual problem, which tends to conceive of it as a theoretical problem exclusively, you know, with certain empirical parameters or experimental parameters. And so his definitely, whatever concept of truth he's trying to come up with has to have as much room for defining our intuitive relationship to it, our, you know, I hesitate to use this, but our pre-given connection to it. Partly, I guess you could say that McGilchrist is trying to describe pre-givenness, like he's almost taking up an ancient program of Socrates or of Plato, and trying to say, okay, how do we already have a relationship to truth?
Right.
In some respects, his answer is the brain. You know, his answer is, well, we have this entity, this technology, this organism, that on the one hand is like extremely practically engaged in the cognitive processes of speech and memory, but also has this rather strange structure. It's broken down into these two hemispheres. And these two hemispheres, the fact that they're not only a division, but an asymmetric division, right? That going throughout his research is this idea that the right hemisphere dominance is a really important dominance. It's the dominance of creativity. The right hemisphere tends to do everything better, only because it's concerned with the big picture, and whereas the left hemisphere is concerned with a narrow fine-tuning in terms of its relationship with the world, grasping. And McGilchrist even goes so far as to show relationships between literally the act of grasping with one's hand and the way that this develops into the left hemisphere perspective at a higher level. So he's interested in then going on to show that maybe this organizational principle exists within reality. And this is one of his ways to truth, we might call it. He wants to show that, well, maybe something like this asymmetric division is a part of what we find in reality no matter where we look, and the brain is simply the most sophisticated, most sort of cosmically developed version of it. And this also leads them in an interesting way to the pre-Socratics, doesn't it?
Right.
In terms of looking at the original instance, not only of philosophy, but also of physics. So back in a time when science and philosophy were actually done together and were not considered separate disciplines.
Well, I would perhaps hesitate to agree with what you just said. You know, when you say that he thinks this asymmetry, that there's a fundamental asymmetry in reality, and that in the brain we find it just in the most interesting or obvious way. I think he does have at least one little passage in the book where he says, you know, these asymmetries, well, it gets quite reflexive, maybe we can get into that, but he says, like, these asymmetries, they are not just, it's not like in reality actually they're out there. I think he does think that, you know, when he says the right hemisphere is more in touch with things, I think that is very much his perspective. Of course, that also means a right hemisphere view of the very distinction between the left and the right hemisphere. So I think in any case, you know, he wouldn't just want to say the asymmetry is just out there.
I don't think that's what I meant to say. I think I meant to say that it's an organizational principle of reality, and therefore it figures into the concept of truth. So I don't know if is truth out there? Is that the concept, or are we immersed in the truth? You know, is truth a tree, an object, a process, or is it the organizational principle, say, of a tree or a process? And I think this is where we get this question of immersion. You know, we're in it, and this creates a slightly strange structure as far as getting to the truth in reality.
Yes. Okay.
And we know, for instance, that McGilchrist is not interested in it's all in your head or it's all out there. He rejects both these typical paradigms of organizing truth relations or capital T truth. For one thing, because we have this problem of immersion, right? That we're already in it. So how do we possibly gain any distinctions? And I think this is where the principle of asymmetry enters in, because the concept of the brain, and one should almost argue that the conceptuality of the brain almost comes before its appearance as an organic material, is, well, both the left and the right hemisphere do everything. They each have a concept of time, they each have a concept of space, they each have a bearing on all of the cognitive processes. But their principal responsibility is to organize reality in the first place, which involves interpretation and decision making. And the ways that this interpretation and decision making seems to be organized is on the basis that you have one which takes the big view, 359 degrees of your spatial view, so to speak, and the other takes 1 degree. And this is a sort of inherent principle of dominance in terms of one viewpoint being in particular essential. It needs to be the master, as it were, to the emissary of the left hemisphere. And it's not that one doesn't need the fine-tuning. Of course, McGilchrist argues that one needs both very vitally. But when it comes to truth, it's a question either very particularly of looking at the brain and asking how does it come up with its interpretations and theories of reality, but then at a higher level, why is it that our organizational pictures of reality, our instrument for reality, I won't say construction, but piecing together the organic material that is immersed in the truth and sort of has the truth kind of imprinted on or within it, that is somehow something which seems to bear out this asymmetry principle.
Well, I mean, of course you could ask, where does the asymmetry in the brain come from? Right. Is that the kind of question?
Well, if we look into his other answers when he reflects on the pre-Socratics and physics and philosophy as a joint discipline, he seems to be very interested in the concept of coinciding opposites, and also of the spiral figure.
Yeah.
Now, I would consider these to be perhaps species of asymmetry. For instance, the spiral involves re-intersecting at the same point but at a higher level, that's an asymmetric structure, in my opinion.
Yeah.
The coincidence of opposites is also involves, I think, only comes to the point of equilibrium that it achieves because there is a certain dimension of asymmetry. And as you already pointed out, even asymmetry of asymmetry. So there's a right hemisphere view of the hemispheric division and a left hemisphere view of the hemispheric division. And what is it that you think perhaps we're missing about McGilchrist's view?
I think I guess I want us to get at why I suppose the question of where those structures actually are or where they come from, or the organizational principles as you call them, is you can also see that in a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere way. Right.
But maybe this is why McGilchrist is so interested in phenomenology, because he's interested in how materiality as it has appeared in the early 20th century in philosophy is no longer considered to be necessarily a substance, or a transcendentalized substance, but that material is something that we're already in. We're already material. We engage in other materialities.
Yeah.
So even the question that you're asking for McGilchrist of structure seems to miss the whole reflexivity of asymmetry, which is this question of finding an organizational principle on the one hand, which is not going to be a piece of material, but finding it, and here's the phenomenological demand, through material. You're not going to find a metaphysical principle. Again, I think this is where we get back to this opening question of McGilchrist's frustration with traditional theories of truth, the traditional distinction between physics and philosophy, between any study of reality that organizes itself as divided between an empirical dimension and a purely conceptual dimension. I think that for him, the great advantage, again, of studying particularly the brain, and then more generally say these asymmetries, is that you approach almost something like a material that has this swirl within it, right? That has this has the ultimate coincidence of opposites, you might argue.
Right.
Almost more so than any other phenomenon of nature. And is it any surprise that the swirl that is the brain also seems to be the seat of the most, at least, intense form of consciousness that the cosmos has? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it's telling that he focuses on the brain actually, and that is his sort of entry point into, I mean, I think in a way he's trying to bring a certain reflexivity back into science, right?
Definitely.
And, you know, because he could have also been like, or he could have also chosen to focus on, say, the skin, because with our skin we interact with the outside world. It's like our largest organ, right? From a, you know, if you're thinking about the embodied perspective.
I think that's true, and I think the skin is a barrier, though, and the brain is not a barrier. The brain has lots of barriers within it.
Right.
And this is not just a question of complexity. It's not that the brain is simply more complex than the skin. But again, we're talking about almost conceptual divisions.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that the skin thinks of itself as a barrier.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it has many other functions as well. It's a very complex barrier, a multi-layered barrier, and the pores and various other material distinctions. But again, in the brain, we almost get this uncanny intersection of concept and matter. And this is where things get really quite unique, is that it's not simply that you have a function of the material on the one hand, and then some concept of what it is on the other. So say you have the system of defense, in a sense, that is the skin, and the various ways that it organizes defense, but also the barrier as a concept. There's a gap there. I think they're not fully intersectional. I think the skin is sort of still trying to maintain under the pressures of its performance, but the brain, not only because it kind of organizes the skin and everything else to do with the skin, but because it's also, I think, this intersection, in a sense, between matter and concept, because it brings so closely together the thoughts that the brain has about itself as a material thing, you know, but also it's a material thing thinking about itself as a concept. And because, well, what is the brain? Would we say it's another barrier? No. Would we say it's like a hand or an eye? Is it concerned with vision? Is it concerned with... It seems to be concerned with, well, the brain. It seems to be concerned with the apparatus of radical interpretation, of radical, you know, piecing reality together, of carving through reality as a kind of extremely radically open-ended cosmic experience of flow. I know McGilchrist does describe the brain as an aperture which lets things in or out in terms of the flux that one finds in reality. But again, at the heart of this flux is a need for this flux to find itself interpreted by something like the brain. And this is a conceptual point. It's not just that there's a causal organism that happens to do this carving and or interpretive work, but that it seems to be an important concept for, you know, our view of reality, for reality's view of itself, that there's something that interprets it called the brain, or called, in a sort of larger sense, called consciousness. But also that the brain itself has within it, again, this hemispheric division. That it has, and again, clearly maybe what we're trying to say here is that the hemispheric division is just the swirl. It is just a product of this coincidence of opposites.
Yeah. It's interesting that one of the most striking images in contemporary philosophy otherwise of the brain is the brain in the vat, which is this idea that it's kind of a play on a skeptical thought experiment, right? The brain could be, all our experiences could be the same if we were a brain in the vat.
The idea is that your experience is simulated. You have no body, you don't actually have any experiences, your experiences are sent to you.
But you have no body, but somehow you still have a brain that is supposed to do the work, right, of like thinking or imagining. So it's a funny like substrate.
Well, maybe this gets at sort of McGilchrist's conceptual point again about, you know, why do we have a brain? Why do we have a body? At one point he makes the argument that our language, which is considered a rather typical mediator between brain and body, between mind and body, is, well, but you can find many of the groundwork for many of our linguistic concepts in embodied practices. So again, literally he draws attention to the grasping of the hand and certain words for intellectual grasping. There are many good examples in German. And for him, this is not an accident. It's not simply metaphor that we've added later. It's a metaphor that is already there in the body. And this means that whatever the relationship between the brain and the body is, well, the brain is clearly an embodied... The brain is clearly an embodied experience. But rather than it being that the brain simply exists fully formed on one end and the brain fully formed on the other, clearly there's been a very long conversation in terms of building up, let's call it the reality distinctions. Again, at what point does this embodied entity, so an organism, develop the skin barrier? Or maybe just the basic cellular barrier? But if we treat these as conceptual distinctions, how do these concepts themselves get expanded? At what point does a brain emerge? Now we know that asymmetry is there almost from the beginning, even in the simplest of cells, which is interesting. But the brain, does it have a moment in which it emerges at a particular point? I almost feel this misses the point, but it does get at one of the deeper philosophical points I would say McGilchrist is striking at, which is, well, maybe the brain has to appear at some point because there is a relationship between general reality or the cosmos and some kind of interpretive device. As in, it's not, again, an accident that the brain emerged. Reality needs something like a brain at the end of the day. And so even if we pass through various stages of awareness, from mineral awareness, if you can call it that, to plant awareness, eventually we reach something like the awareness which human beings have at the moment, which has the reflexive power of being kind of, again, carved out. So it is almost a conversation that reality is having with itself. But again, reality seems to need this externalized instrument. And not only that, but an instrument that has a division within itself. These are very strange principles. One, philosophically, but also introducing these into what is meant to be a study of nature, or material reality, or more generally science, again, is probably a pretty good description of what the philosophical stakes of McGilchrist's project are. What do you think?
Well, I think that, usually in philosophy, if this conceptual dimension of the brain is missing, because usually I think references to the brain serve as a kind of debunking, or as a kind of I guess usually references to the brain are made without reflecting on how the brain itself is making this reference to the brain, right? Or I guess that is one kind of problem, but then the other one is mind, or something like that. Yeah, I guess because of what I just said, because people refer to the brain in a certain way, when then mind is supposed to, when you then want to say anything about the mind by saying something about the brain, people are very, very skeptical, very wary of that. But I think McGilchrist does not fall into that kind of, he doesn't fall into that way of thinking at all, because he does want to reflect on how it's the brain that makes these distinctions about the brain, and how that actually forces us to enrich our concept of the brain.
But probably because what he thinks is that reality is open to distinctions. The fact that reality is open to distinctions is not a trivial point, because it presumes that something like a brain exists to make distinctions.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I suppose he avoids is saying, well, those distinctions are already in reality, and the brain just captures them, relays them, or organizes them. But it's very clear in his argument that it's the brain that makes these distinctions. But on what basis does it organize distinctions? Do those distinctions, again, already exist in reality? My understanding is that one really has to rely on this concept of flux here.
Okay.
That rather than it being that there really are trees and light, dappling through the tree work, or flower petals on the ground, or sticks, or leaves, or a big field in which you're sitting, that's precisely what the brain has organized. And so we ask the very empirical question, well, where did the brain get these concepts?
Yeah.
Where did it get the idea of a tree so that it could shape the flux, as it were, into a tree, into a field? But this is sort of the magical question in a way. The flux is open already to being made distinguishable. So clearly it's not as if the flux comes in and the brain is just another piece of flux. I think the entire point, and this is why we get back to asymmetry, spirals, the swirls, and the coincidence of opposites, the reason why these are almost the structures for McGilchrist, not say traditional structures of space and time, or traditional physics of force, as applicable as those are within many intellectual domains, he seems to be interested in the fact that no, the brain is also kind of already there, not as a fully formed entity, but somehow flux, is going to reach this point where it's either going to intersect with itself, come up with these kinds of swirls, or it already has some kind of asymmetric division within it, which means, and this is very interesting, that within the flux is already multi-layered perspectives, multi-layered operations of interpretation. So not only are there multiple ways of looking at the tree, but then when you look into the brain and you ask yourself, well, why do we have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere? Why do we even have two different perspectives in the first place? Well, it's because it's almost as if two different perspectives kind of must exist already in reality, as if reality and or flux already operates with perspective internally. So then what the brain organizes is not, it doesn't introduce a series of concepts ex nihilo, and nor does it simply then introduce them into reality and organizes reality as this kind of otherwise indistinguishable matter. I think it seems as if this layering of interpretation is, in a sort of inverted way, more what reality is than the flux. You know, the flux at its most conceptual and structural has interpretation and reflexivity and asymmetry within it, which sort of not only makes room for the brain, but almost makes it highly anticipatable that we would have a brain in the first place that would structure these interpretations, and which is basically nothing but an interpretation machine.
So, more towards the beginning there, when you said, you know, we have this question of where do these distinctions come from in the brain? And then we ended up at saying that this interpretation is very much part of, you know, reality, or reality is very much engaged in making these interpretations. Where does the, well, you then introduced the concept of flux.
I think the idea is that flux has an asymmetric structure too.
Right, but where do we get that concept of flux? I guess I'm wondering.
The original concept of flux or the asymmetric flux?
The original one first. Like,
asymmetric flux or flux?
Flux.
I have no idea. It's an idea that McGilchrist comes up with to rather, I think, intuitively describe this carving operation.
Well, that's a good point, because I think I do, you know, when you read through his descriptions of the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere, you could also ask yourself, okay, on what basis is he grouping these? You know, how do we know, like, how do we know what falls under, say, left hemisphere? Or the left hemisphere kind of attention and the right hemisphere kind of attention. If I don't know if we want to say that he has to somehow assume the concept of flux, and only that allows him to even draw that distinction.
No, because I don't think flux is actually the primary distinction.
Okay.
I think it's a conceptual consequence of him having noticed a variety of phenomena, from the asymmetry to asymmetry in the brain. And again, in part of maybe historical and philosophical approach of trying to reunify physics and philosophy, where many of these ideas existed, where it was an important part of an account of the physical world. In fact, where we got our concept of a physical world as a distinction at all, was grounded for these early philosophers, the pre-Socratic philosophers, in certain concepts of coincidence of opposites, spirals, vortices at the, you know, at the center of reality, a lineage which, you know, exists here and there. You know, of course, he opens his masterpiece, The Matter with Things, with a quote from Plotinus, who is a Neoplatonist, but probably not until, I would say, rigorously until Hegel and Schelling. So in German idealism, and of course Hegel was a big reader of Plotinus, which is a whole other episode. But yeah, so flux is an offshoot of needing to then model reality in a certain way that makes sense for the brain. And this is an important philosophical move. Rather than saying, how do I fit the brain into reality, McGilchrist says, how do I fit reality into the brain? How do I explain reality in view of the fact that there is something like a brain within it? Now, of course, this has a reflexive structure as well, because obviously what I think the brain is might prove rather important. And if I think of the brain as something that can exist in a vat, right, so a brain without a body, which doesn't make any sense, I think, both for phenomenological reasons, so the sort of intellectual lineage to which McGilchrist refers to, at least in terms of his modern sources, but also because the brain in the vat is a fantasy image. I don't think it's possible, because, as you already mentioned, the fact that the brain is there is not trivial.
Yeah.
It's not as if, but you just have everything that you need for interpretation.
Right.
Because, of course, what we presume with the brain in a vat is, well, again, there's information still coming in, there's the possibility, at least conceptually, of organizing that information, and in this view, the brain is simply a technology in the worst sense, in the most reduced sense, an organization of interpretations that already exist. But this is what I think makes McGilchrist such a great philosopher, is that he's not interested in positing in advance what the categories are going to be.
Yeah, exactly.
He wants to say, well, I'm not going to say what interpretations exactly the brain is going to come up with, such as those that I might sort of send through signals to the brain in the brain in the vat metaphor. I want to use the structure of the brain to help figure out reflexively what these categories should be, what information should be, what really exists in reality. So I want to use, again, the brain to help me, now going in the reverse direction, to understand what things are in reality, but only insofar as I have reality, which makes room for being interpreted, for having swirls and vortices, asymmetries and coincidences of opposites, i.e. A reality that seems to non-trivially need a brain in the first instance as a primary part of how it gets started from the very beginning.
I think much of contemporary philosophy thinks that it can just not pay attention to the brain, or because say one would want to give a description of reality before there were any humans there, or that would be kind of a bit of a flat-footed argument perhaps, but this kind of view from nowhere universality is very much what contemporary philosophy wants to achieve, missing the fact that that you have to reflect on how you could even get that perspective on the world, as it were. Right?
Or why something like perspective is there in the first place. I think this is the thing, is that the excessive dimension of the brain is that there is interpretation. And rather than treating interpretation as a view from nowhere, as you put it, as a kind of metaphysical standpoint that we already have, maybe the really quirky thing about reality is there's this thing called interpretation.
Yeah.
In our modern view, we consider interpretation to be a natural part of reality, a pluralism of viewpoints, right? Because we all take this metaphysical stance on objective reality.
Yeah.
And to that extent, we're inclined to think that interpretation is there from the beginning. But in the sense that without human beings, or without a brain, or perhaps even without any of these asymmetric fluxes, you have interpretation. There's some viewpoint. But what if the really weird, excessive thing that is already there when we sort of get to the core of reality is interpretation, is sort of capital P perspective, which rather than being the simple standpoint from which we view reality, is almost the excessive engine by which reality gets started. So for instance, our entire concept of objects seems to emerge with perspective already there in hand. It's not as if objects already exist without perspective, right? So then again, in a humanless universe, you still have objects. I wonder whether those objects don't simply exist as objects, but rather than putting the emphasis on the human being and saying, well, the human being has to kind of be there, or the human being implements a certain concept of objects. I imagine that if objects are already there, it's because perspective is already there. And I think this is independent of humans. But that also means that perspective is there without there being a viewer. Viewpoint is there without there being a viewer. There's something called embedded perspective.
How does that work?
Well, it's actually an idea that you find here and there in phenomenology, but also in other domains of thinking. And one of the best examples of it actually comes from Merleau-Ponty. And he talks about a glove. And when you talk about the interior or the exterior of a glove, you basically, one, it's not a great question, because when you flip it inside out, you immediately get the interior and the exterior, and then you flip it the other way, you also get the interior and the exterior. So he says of the glove, there's no need for an external observer, because the glove already has perspective in it.
That you can distinguish between internal and external?
In that it has internal and external already built into its structure.
Right.
We don't need to import that. So then again, when we get back to this point of this viewpoint from nowhere, which is an excellent critique of much of modern thinking and modern philosophy, you can see how, well, we should maybe actually, it's not that we should reject the idea of a humanless view onto reality. And say, oh, that's just bad metaphysics. And analytic philosophy, or really philosophy generally, makes use of this viewpoint from nowhere and builds big metaphysics out of it. But we should sort of try and argue, well, what if, in a rather almost Kafkaesque move, perspective is already there before any human being gets there? Things are already being seen, or acting as if they're seen, or organized as if viewpoint were another structure alongside asymmetry, coincidence of opposites, spirals and vortices. And but we might even say, if we really want to go further here, and say that these four things are simply species of perspective. And that definitely gets at, I think, the core philosophical critique of McGilchrist's project of modern philosophy, modern science, which is a fixation and obsession with perspective as a kind of conditional, situational, or causal feature, something that kind of emerges after, from which we then build epistemic models of reality or representative models of reality. But it seems to me as if reality already seems to have perspective in it, and therefore our challenge of figuring out what is true or what reality is a much more reflexive one.
Yeah.
And we require objects like the glove, or more conceptual things like asymmetry, in order to get our bearings in terms of what we come up with as the meaningful distinctions or interpretations for what we think reality really is. Which is, of course, why McGilchrist's slightly meta point is to show how, well, the ultimate category of interpretation is interpretation itself, which he treats to be almost a fundamental characteristic of reality.
Right. Well, perhaps we could think a bit about what philosophical project follows from McGilchrist. How are we supposed to do philosophy with these insights in mind? I mean, in one sense, perhaps not that much has changed, because you could say that this kind of sense that perspective is already in reality, that we are already embedded in reality, and that is out of that position that we then seek to explain anything. You could definitely find people in the history of philosophy who seem to have gone there, right, to that.
Yeah, I would almost be more inclined to mention writers who have gone there rather than philosophers.
Okay.
I already mentioned Kafka, and I actually think it's a rather important reference, because it's not even so much that we're, as human beings, just immersed in reality. It's a little bit more uncanny. It's that we are ourselves caught up in a perspective that is not our own. And some people have called this God, and in modern psychoanalytical theory it's called the big other. The feeling that we're being watched, but not by a really existing entity, but as if reality, again, already has a certain kind of perspective within it, the ultimate sort of excess of which is this idea of perspective as being not an illuminating, objective viewpoint on something, but as being the excessive object itself. Here we get the kind of ultimate dialectical turn. Rather than perspective being the viewpoint onto things, onto objects, it's the ultimate object itself to be explained, the ultimate sort of strangeness. But of course, it's a totally reflexive project in order to do so. So one should probably reimagine the human being on similar grounds. Our immersion is not so much, in my opinion, a kind of cosmic immersion, in which, say, we going back to that point of Plato's, we simply have to remember what's possible, what we already know to be true, which is a divine perspective, is seated in the concept of the divine, of a divinity, which can be as cosmic as you like, as cosmically general. I think the idea is much more interesting when you read it through Kafka as meaning, well, maybe all of our strange sense of anxiety, for instance, and our reflective sense, for instance, of responsibility, comes from how do we exist when our immersion comes to us not in the form of a pre-given understanding, but in terms of a kind of excessive viewpoint which has kind of capital O objectivity, but not as something which we get to sort of naively interact with as already there, as really existing, but as this kind of variable which precedes us. And then the human being is the kind of anxious project of trying to fit within it as a highly reflexive enterprise. Because of course, well, if we're doing all of the interpreting, we're not fitting into a world of objects. What we're fitting into is a world in which there is this interpretation as the ultimate feature of reality, actually, to be explained philosophically. So you get a kind of sort of the structure of a Kafka novel, you know, trying to figure out what reality is a little bit like the trial or the castle. It is like we have these sort of deep metaphors for what we think reality should look like, but there's no really existing taskmaster or authority that is there, almost as if the castle was built before human beings even arrived, and reality sort of has this effect upon us. But rather than arguing that reality therefore was sort of actually again made by something or someone, what if the designed, as it were, effect of reality is to appear as if it was put there, but that this in and of itself is a feature of reality, that this is how reality is supposed to look like. And this again is what we mean by interpretation or perspective already being there. A tree is sort of already looks as if it's meant to be seen, right? As if it's in its structure, its very appearance. Perspective is sort of embedded in there, but then of course when we try and come up with a bigger philosophy of nature or a scientific account of reality, we have to try and explain, not simply in this viewpoint from nowhere, oh, how is a tree there, and how do we build it up from certain causal or empirical constraints or certain metaphysical axioms, but how is this perspective already there? How is a tree already structured with perspective in mind, if that perspective doesn't have a particular perspective, a particular possessor or owner of that perspective? So as if we walk through reality and we have again the feeling of being watched, but it's an effect of reality itself, not the effect of someone or something actually watching us. But you can even see how all the madness of reason, of rationality, seems to emerge from this. We become desperately engaged in trying to come up with an objective account, almost as if to explain this uncanny feeling that we get. You know, and when you try to supplement a metaphysics of nowhere, or a viewpoint from nowhere, you can see how this is kind of a dangerous misunderstanding, because you're trying to find that really existing authority, which Kafka already basically teaches us is the ultimate fantasy, because it's much more horrifying, and therefore in a sense more real for Kafka, if there is no authority actually organizing the experience. The experience is merely designed to look as if it is organized, as if there is some embedded watcher, but that this is a kind of effect of reality. And so, the project of rationality or reason sort of proceeds a little bit from this madness or this uncertainty. And therefore, you know, when properly done, has to submit itself to this kind of crazy reflexivity in order for us to figure out what this immersion means without just positing some kind of metaphysical pre-givenness.
Well, it's interesting because before we talked about kind of, you know, enriching our concept of the brain, seeing the importance of the brain, seeing all the things it can do, how important it is for, I mean, this is what McGilchrist is all about, right? How important the brain is for the concepts we have. So but you've just given us the other side of this, which is that the brain isn't this kind of authority, you know, and if we could only figure out how the brain works, then perhaps we could have the ultimate theory of reality. Or, you know, in analytic philosophy, this, again, you know, the brain in a vat, the brain is really, as an authoritative source when it comes to thinking about reality or figuring out reality. McGilchrist kind of dethrones the brain from that kind of authority, I think.
It gives us a much more interesting version of it. He inverts the traditional relationship. The brain, you would think, would be the ultimate perspective giver, the ultimate watcher, the ultimate device to be manipulated by totalitarian political authorities. You know, it's the ultimate sort of fantasy object, you know, kind of horrifying object, even the seat. You know, you don't even need a body. In fact, do you even know whether everything you're thinking is fake? But he also does something really interesting. He doesn't just invert it and say, no. You know, the brain is this tool already for interpreting, but that within reality itself, you know, because of this already existing perspective, that doesn't belong to any one thing or any one person, you almost can use the brain as the ultimate device for investigation. Because if you can figure out, for instance, in a more objective sense, why the brain is there, if you can figure out why interpretation is there, you can get at something deeper about the structure of reality, you know, which would not have been possible if you simply had presumed a very superficial version of the brain, an instrumentalized version of the brain, and then reality again is all out there simply waiting to be interpreted. Nor would you have produced a very interesting philosophical project, because much of what you would say you'd have to really presume, I would think, without necessarily investigating the structure of presumption, without, you know, introducing what we would consider to be the signal thing that makes something philosophical, which is when you can not just question your assumptions or your principles, your axioms, but integrate the questioning of those foundations into the investigation itself.
I wanted to read a quote, actually. It's a very short one. And it's in the introduction to The Matter with Things. I do not claim for an instant that our experience merely is some function in the brain. Quite the contrary, in fact, since my thesis implies that only one part of our brains, the part that understands less, would pursue such an agenda in the first place.
Well, there you get the not just the hemispheric division, but the division within the division, right? The fact that there's a right hemisphere view of the brain and a left hemisphere view of the brain. And this is really maybe the message that McGilchrist is trying to leave people with, as far as a study of the brain at least, is to say, look, it's very important that you emphasize the right hemisphere. It's very important that you live the principle of asymmetry itself, you know, which means taking an asymmetric view of asymmetry. Not simply taking a kind of holistic view of asymmetry, but taking an asymmetrical view of asymmetry means you have to kind of approach the different ways that you can understand this division and recognize that one seems to radically emphasize the bigger picture in which much of this is happening. And I suppose the only thing that I would add to that is, you know, is there ultimately something to the right hemisphere perspective versus the left hemisphere perspective? Or is the really interesting perspective that McGilchrist leaves us with is the kind of open-ended choice in which you get the asymmetry of asymmetry?
Right.
In other words, you know, like, something about McGilchrist's project is almost has the same status as the brain has in nature, you know, in the context of the brain, though, that his investigation is this kind of external thing that seems to give us a reflexive program for understanding reality. You know, I don't know whether there's a particular piece of content or information that you have to learn about the brain.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea is to connect with this concept of asymmetry, of sort of radical interpretation as a feature of reality, and then almost go looking for that in reality. And I think that the brain is maybe nothing more than that. Not only does it radically emphasize decision, choice making, but it seems to also emphasize this kind of perspective which is already there. And in many ways that is the kind of asymmetry. Before you have, you know, a brain, maybe like a human brain, you have kind of sort of freedom on the one hand, and then also this kind of perspective on the other, a perspective that is already there and which we tend to call materiality.
That's a really good point, because it gets at a question some people might be asking themselves when they're McGilchrist, which is, so, you know, should I also now go do science? Should I also learn about the brain? You know, was it all along about bringing philosophy and science into more of a synthesis? And I think you've just given a very good answer to that question, in that it's not even strictly perhaps about, you know, doing one thing or the other, but it's keeping this bigger perspective on perspective itself in mind.
Well, especially when you try and think of that as a material effort. Is our goal to build a better brain? Is our goal to figure out what the next stage of consciousness is beyond the brain?
Mm-hmm.
If the brain is nothing more than this concept of asymmetry, which you can either describe as it's a concept of asymmetry that is materialized in a repeatable, iterable way, or maybe you even just speak more generally and say, oh, it's not, you know, the brain is already engaged with reflexive materiality, you know, so the brain only works because it can introduce reflexive distinctions. It's not an iterable process. The brain is itself what happens when you try to think of something like the brain. And I think you can work a lot with those concepts when you try and go out into the world and create things, or think about technology, or even think about the broader project of philosophy. But it also is important that you reject, I think, some of these utopian ideas that what we're trying to do in any case is, well, again, build a better brain.
Right.
Or yes, simply continue the project of science as it has existed as a divided discipline, or with this sort of metaphysics from nowhere. I think the idea is to try and understand everything as kind of weirdly engaged with many of the dynamics that we see most concentrated in the brain. You know, the dynamics of the spiral and asymmetry and coincidence of opposites, the dimensions of how maybe all things sort of are involved in asking the question of whether they exist, and that is how they kind of minimally come into existence, and that this is somehow related to the fact that what we mean by materiality has to do with some perspective which is already there, which means perspective is a foundational part of reality, not something that is added later.
Mm.